A man sets out for a morning hike through the desert. He's newly married and his wife is expecting their first daughter very soon. He's hoping to get just one last hike in before the new baby arrives. A few hours into his hike, the man becomes disoriented. As he attempts to make his way back to camp, trying this trail and then that one, and then doubling back again, he eventually loses all track of where he came from. By midday, the desert air is sweltering. He tries to conserve his canteen of water, but it lasts him no more than the afternoon. The day turns to night, and the night turns back to day. All the while, the man is becoming increasingly dehydrated. By the time he catches sight of a landmark off in the distance that can guide him back to camp, his thirst has completely overwhelmed him. His tongue is dry as clay, his lips bloody and cracked under the brutal desert sun. Too weak to walk another step, the man's knees give out and he collapses down to the scorched orange earth. This can't be it, he thinks to himself as his body continues shutting down. I can't die out here. My wife can't grow up a single parent. My child can't grow up without her father. As his eyelids close and he begins to slip away into death, suddenly he feels a soft patter of water on his face. The soft patter quickly turns to thick droplets, and he opens his eyes to find himself surrounded by heavy rainfall. Achingly, the man opens his mouth and sticks out his parched tongue. With what little strength he has left, he holds out his canteen and lets the rainwater fill it up. He eagerly chugs it down and then lets it fill again. The life begins to come back to him. The man slowly gets to his feet and sets out for the landmark off in the distance. Soon he makes it back to camp safe and sound, and eventually on home to his wife, who delivers a healthy baby girl just a few weeks later. For the years to come, the man will reflect on the apparent miracle of that rainfall. How serendipitous was its timing in a desert that hardly rains at all. A gift, a kind of intervention, a sign that his story mattered. He was meant to live. He was meant to be there as husband to his wife and father to his newborn daughter. This story, though fictional, is one example of what the luminary Swiss psychologist Carl Jung referred to as synchronicity. There's a lot of arcane ways of describing synchronicity. The dictionary definition is, quote, the simultaneous occurrence of events which appear significantly related but have no discernible causal connection, end quote. To break that down in the context of the lost hiker story, there was nothing he did to cause the rain to fall at the very moment that it did. He had no hand in it coming to pass. Yet the rainfall lined up with the facts of his own life, his own condition, in such a powerful and pertinent way. It came right as he was on the cusp of dying of thirst and never meeting his baby daughter. The timing was so uncannily perfect, it would appear that that event transcended mere coincidence. While moments of synchronicity in our own lives might not be quite as poetic or life and death as the lost hiker's was, who among us hasn't encountered some event external to ourselves that synced up with our own internal lives in such an unlikely way that it felt much, much deeper than plain dumb luck? There are endless forms this phenomenon can take. Maybe as you found yourself thinking of a loved one that's passed away, their favorite song came on the radio. Maybe the week you were passed over for a promotion at work, an old friend called you out of the blue with an interesting new opportunity. Maybe it was simply encountering an unusual symbol in your waking life that you had just experienced in a vivid dream the night prior. Anytime our own interior lives intersect in space and time with the outer world in a striking way, in a significant way, in a way that seems so against the odds, we can't help but assign a tremendous amount of meaning to it. That's synchronicity. Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson actually has my favorite description of synchronicity. He offered it on his podcast in an episode he recorded this past spring with the artist Jonathan Pajot. He describes synchronicity as when the objective and the narrative world touch. He said, quote, we have a narrative sense of the world. It's not real. We treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world, though. But the narrative and objective world touch. End quote. Now, before continuing on with the topic of synchronicity, I'd like to spend some time lingering on this narrative sense of the world that Jordan Peterson referenced here. To use Abraham Lincoln's adage, give me 6 hours to chop down the tree and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe, I'd contend that without first becoming more conscious of this narrative sense that's active in all of us, without sharpening that axe, I think it's really hard for us to become conscious of what's going on when we encounter a synchronicity. So with that said, let's investigate it. We all know that humans have a natural affinity for stories and storytelling. We love our TV and our movies and our books and our plays and that friend of ours that's always had a knack for telling good stories. Salespeople and politicians love stories because stories are more persuasive than facts. Kids love stories. Octogenarians love stories. The ancient Romans loved stories. The earliest known human civilizations love stories. As a species, we have this unique aptitude to abstract the world into symbolic art. It's a kind of cognitive technology. Be it the myths our ancestors were illustrating on cave walls tens of thousands of years ago, or a 2021 release in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's the same phenomenon at work. It's the human animal with nothing more than the inspiration of its natural physical environment, coming to see the world not for what it is, but for what it could be. Never mind the laws of nature, never mind the limits of our sensory experience. The human mind says, well, I've observed what a man is, and I've observed what a bird is, so why then, in my mind's eye, can I not borrow the wings of a bird and fashion them on a winged man? And when I draw this winged man down, look what happens when I share it with other humans. They effortlessly understand the image, even though none of us have ever bared witness to a winged man in the flesh. And so why not take it a step further? I've observed kingdoms down here on earth, and I've observed clouds up above in the sky. Why then can I not imagine a kingdom beyond the clouds, out of sight? And I've observed armies down here on earth, so why then can I not imagine an army of winged men living in a kingdom out of sight beyond the clouds? And so on and so forth, iterating and iterating until you get to the book of Revelations, where that army of winged men comes down to kill a third of mankind. You can also think of our narrative sense of the world as a kind of sixth sense that runs at a layer separate from the other five, interpreting the physical world through symbols and the stories attached to those symbols. When we're living from this sense, as we almost always are, we're in a kind of persistent, productive, hallucinatory state. This is the sense that allows us to see words as information and not just merely lines on a page. This is the sense that allows us to see an Olympic gold medal as a symbol of tremendous merit and not just a hunk of shiny metal. This is the sense that allows us to see a middle finger as a sign of contempt and not just an outstretched digit. This is the sense that allows us to see the White House as the emblem of a global superpower and not just a rectangular mass of gray-colored sandstone. So ingrained in our perception is this hallucination that it's only when we actually engage the psychedelic experience that this sixth sense drops away. Words return to their natural state as just lines on a page. The White House returns to its natural state as just a rectangular mass of gray-colored sandstone. I think psychedelics simplify your perception, quieting your narrative symbolic sense, so you can see the world only for what is actually there. And as a result, often the symbols and stories that slip under your radar as entirely unremarkable in a normal state of mind now appear glaringly silly and contrived. Your model of the world reveals itself to be a complex of distinctions with few non-symbolic differences. You might begin asking yourself, what's the non-symbolic difference between sneakers and dress shoes if both clothe your feet? What's the non-symbolic difference between a royal and a commoner if beneath the royal mantle is the same primate species you'd find beneath the peasant's tunic? What's the non-symbolic difference between a Republican and a Democrat if neither are actually civically engaged? What's the non-symbolic difference between a dog and a pig if both are conscious, intelligent, and able to form close bonds with humans? If both enjoy belly rubs and wag their tails when they're happy? Is it the concrete morphological differences between the two that sanction us to eat one and not the other? Or is it the symbolic differences, the contrasting stories we tell ourselves about each animal? You might ask, just how many times have I allowed myself to be duped in this way, confusing a symbolic difference for a concrete one? In the psychedelic state, multitudes and multitudes of these cast iron distinctions that we use to discern our world are hoisted up from the depths of our unquestioning subconscious to the surface for examination. And once we have the chance to really look at them and handle them, many prove to be hollow. immaterial in both senses of the word, neither tangible nor important. And so for a brief period they are allowed to dissolve away, leaving us with a clearer, more fluid view into the raw miracle of life, love, and pristine sensory experience. That is until the effects of the dose wear off and the complex of these learned symbolic distinctions begins to build itself back up again, once again filtering our perceptual inputs, regulating our flow of thoughts. We remember how to read the instructions on the back of the pizza box. We remember which series of buttons turn the oven on. The sixth sense is reactivated, and as saturated as it might be with specious distinctions, it offers a great deal of useful distinctions as well. It's what allows us to interface competently with the symbolic world that surrounds us. Though liberating the psychedelic experience surely is, we can admit afterwards it's not a state wherein we could get much done. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, the late great Ernest Becker wrote, quote, "Man has a symbolic identity that brings him sharply out of nature. He is a symbolic self, a creature with a name, a life history. He is a creator with a mind that soars out to speculate about atoms and infinity, who can place himself imaginatively at a point in space and contemplate bemusedly his own planet. This immense expansion, this dexterity, this ethereality, this self-consciousness gives to man literally the status of a small god in nature." End quote. The symbolic identity that Becker so gorgeously describes here is, in my view, really the same idea as the narrative sense that we get from Peterson. And as Becker points out, this symbolic identity affords man not only the ability to see stories and symbols out there in the world around him, but it also allows him to construct his own personal life history as well. Our narrative sense of the world manifests not only in our shared language, in our shared culture, in our shared norms, but also in the way we perceive the course of our own individual lives. It compels us to see our individual lives as unique stories that we're acting out. And as Jung and Peterson and Becker would probably all agree, this individual story plays a critical role in organizing a person's psychological life. This comes through quite clearly in the language we use to describe the arc of our lives. We speak of our time here on Earth as our life story, and as us the authors of that story. We parse out our lives into chapters. When we leave a job, or we get married, or we move to a new city, we speak of such events as closing one chapter and beginning another. When we get to middle age, we talk about starting our second act. And we aren't just using this language as flowery metaphor. This way of describing our existence resonates with us on an extremely deep level. We're deadly serious about our life stories, and we're wickedly vigilant against anything that could disrupt our stories. Our bedrock identities rest in these stories. What are we if not this character we've created for ourselves in narrative reality? Dale Carnegie famously said in How to Win Friends and Influence People, quote, "Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language," end quote. And why might that be the case? I mean, what a peculiar thing for an animal to do to begin with, to give itself a name. Us just flesh and blood mortal creatures with a lineage that traces back through nameless monkeys, and before that nameless shrews, and before that nameless fish, and before that nameless bacteria. Perhaps we love our names so much because without our names we wouldn't have our characters, and without our characters we wouldn't have our stories. We don't want to live our lives in the realm of the anonymous, the collective, the generic animal. For better or for worse, we've left that realm behind. We've risen out of the soil and up into the imaginal space of the great human drama with all its abstractedness and profundity and sanctimony and neurosis. All the world's a stage, as Shakespeare said. And to each of us, even the humblest among us, it feels as though we have been cast into our own leading role. Each of us is born into the center of our own narrative. Again from Ernest Becker, quote, "In man, a working level of narcissism is inseparable from self-esteem, from a basic sense of self-worth," end quote. As a consequence of the primacy we assign to our own lives, whatever character we become, whatever story we find ourselves in, is the story we end up using to interpret reality itself. If we are a martyr, then reality becomes a story of sacrifice. If we are an adventurer, then reality becomes a story of expedition. If we are an activist, then reality becomes a story of justice. If we are an artist, then reality becomes a story of expression. Now, Jordan Peterson's statement that our internal narratives are not objectively real is one you can spend a very long time thinking about. It's a deeply intimidating idea to contemplate that our narrative sense of the world might not be as real as we perceive it to be, given the fact that our narrative sense of the world seems to be our primary sense of the world. To badly misconstrue or misconstruct our own high-level narratives would be to fundamentally misjudge reality itself. This line of thought invites us to confront some pretty haunting questions. What is objectively there in the world before us, and what are just the psychic shadows we're projecting onto it? What is actual, and what is mirage? We might ask, how much of the story we're telling ourselves about who we are and what life is and what matters most would prove ignorant or delusional or unimportant or simply false if we were given the chance to step out of ourselves for a day and see life through the eyes of, say, two other people, to triangulate a more comprehensive worldview through the experiences of two other people with life stories remote to our own. What about 1 million other people? What if we were able to literally walk in 1 million different people's shoes for a day each, and we were able to witness life from their first-person perspective, and then return to ourselves with these memories? Surely our conception of who we are and what life is would be radically altered, perhaps even completely busted apart. Imagine how intensely humbling it might be to return to yourself and find a person with a collection of core beliefs and aspirations that with your newfound wisdom now seem totally frivolous. To come back to your story and realize it's not nearly as epic or precious or accurate as you'd taken it to be. It's not our fault, though, that these narratives that play in our heads are inherently myopic. We're all guilty of this same short-sightedness. No single person's narrative reality can come into total union with objective reality, with the way things actually are. We're too tiny for that. We're too uninformed. Our years are too finite. Our bodily needs are too immediate. Our lens is too subjective for a single person to get that kind of perspective. Despite its limitations, one might argue that this narrative view of the world is not one we would want to dispense with. One might argue that the story we imagine ourselves to be acting out is the great motivating force in our lives. It's what gives us a resolution to envision and move toward. It compels us to formulate a moral to our story and to act in accordance with that moral, to advance along our narrative arc. Our stories can center us when we drift off course. They steady us in the face of tragedy and hardship. A young man starting from scratch might tell himself, right now I'm just climbing the mountaintop. At the mountaintop there's going to be a house and a family and a career. And when I get there, I'm going to be a good father and a good husband. I may not have all these things now, but I'm climbing towards them. I can get there if I keep my shit together, and when I get there, it'll be worth the work. I've made mistakes in the past, but I've learned from them. They've got me to this point in the journey, and from here, I have everything I need to keep climbing. As far as stories go, that's a pretty good one. That's a pretty generative story. That's a story that a young person could successfully organize their actions and their self-concept around. Certainly better than, the world screwed me. There's no point in trying now. Now, that story may not be as real or demonstrable as something we could point to or pick up in the material world. The hero's journey is not as plainly real as a kitchen chair. The mountain climb metaphor is not as plainly real as a physical mountain. Whatever story you're telling yourself about your own life is not as verifiable as the atoms in your brain that are producing that story. But maybe these narratives are real in a different sort of way. They're certainly not fake. No one would say that the hero's journey is fake, or that angels are fake, or that Olympic gold medals are fake. Yes, we might say that they're just fictions, but no one would say that they're fake. Rocky Balboa is a fictional character, but he's not a fake character. And though fictional he may be, he's apparently real enough to mankind to warrant his own statue in Philadelphia. We honor these fictions that have captured our hearts and minds, whether it's Rocky Balboa or gargoyles on the Notre Dame, or simply the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives. We honor them as if they were real, to the point where they do seem to have their own kind of foothold in reality. Consider the imaginary worlds that children conjure up on summer afternoons in the backyard, swinging imaginary swords at each other, dying imaginary deaths, winning imaginary battles. Is that world they've created not real? That world must be real at some level of analysis. It must be there in some way to be so captivating to the children who find themselves lost in it. It seems the ticket of admission children pay to be so spirited away into this imaginal realm is committing themselves completely to something they know isn't entirely real, but is just real enough. It's the same ticket of admission I think that we have to pay as adults to live in our own narrative realms. We know much of how we conceive ourselves and our role in this world exists only in our own minds. We know we're not the great hero we fancy ourselves to be. We know we're not really the main character on a planet we share with 8 billion other humans. But perhaps in order to play the best possible game we can, it serves us well to pretend that we are, to pretend that our life is of tremendous significance. Think about the conviction, the sustained sense of urgency we bring to our own teeny tiny little mortal lives, knowing we're just a single drop in the borderless ocean of history. The importance we put on our next promotion, on our pedigree, on our pet projects. It seems to me no less mad than the conviction a child brings to a showdown with imaginary invaders storming the castle walls in the backyard. But perhaps we need the battle. Perhaps it's a necessary madness. How small and vulnerable would we feel in our fragile, furless animal bodies without our stories to distract us from the brutal facts of life and death? That was sort of Becker's whole point in the denial of death. It seems the perfectly sane thing for us all to do, grappling with the tremendous majesty of this human experience juxtaposed to our imminent decay and demise, would be to just curl up in a ball and shake in terror for the rest of our days. And what fun is there in that? Just as you wouldn't tell a child, there's no need to build a fort in the backyard. The invaders aren't real. Perhaps it does no good to tell someone that their great ambitions in life are just fictions, that their prized collection of stamps are just aged squares of paper, that their mission to see all 50 states before they die has no impact whatsoever on the material world. Of course, it's easy to see the arbitrariness or absurdity in other people's stories, but no doubt you would be pretty upset if others started pointing out the absurdity in your own. It's like you give a dog a superpowered sense of smell. What does it do? It wants to smell things. So you don't get in the way, you let it smell things. Likewise, you give a human a superpowered sense of narrative. What does it do? It wants to seek out narratives in the world. So let it. That seems to be how our species passes the time. Okay, so with all that said, with the proverbial axe somewhat sharpened around what this narrative sense of the world might be, back to Jordan Peterson's definition of synchronicity, as when the objective world and the narrative world touch. As when your narrative, the narrative that stewards your teeny tiny little mortal life through existence, makes contact with objective reality. What exactly is objective reality? Well, as we talked about earlier, objective reality by definition can't ever really be fully known through the skewed, fuzzy little window that is the human perspective. But conceptually, I think of objective reality as simply the universe exactly as it is. It's the material world of a physical magnitude and depth beyond our comprehension, of a size and complexity that is inherently unknowable, a world that was here long before my story started, long before your story started, long before any storytelling creature's story started, and one that will be here long after all of our stories have drawn to a close. It's a material world that very much has its own order, the natural order, that order that keeps the earth spinning around the sun, that order that keeps the electrons in your brain spinning around their nuclei, that order that keeps the rivers flowing through the earth's surface and the blood flowing through your veins. So playing off of Peterson here, a synchronicity is when that narrative force that orders your brief little mortal life, for the most fleeting of moments, converges with the natural order of objective reality. To use the example of the lost hiker in the desert, for a fleeting moment, his own story, the story of, I need to survive so I can play out my role as husband to my wife and father to my daughter. My curtain call can't come before I do that. That storyline intersected gloriously with a life-saving rainfall that came at the very moment it was needed most. The inner and the outer synchronized. The man's story and the natural world harmonized in such a way that it seemed this unfathomably ancient, unfathomably massive universe actually intervened in the man's story out of some apparent regard for his own personal narrative. And that, in my mind, is the very heart of the matter. That's the leap of faith I believe you have to take to believe that synchronicity is more than mere coincidence. Coincidence, in the hiker's case, would be, are you kidding me? The rain didn't actually come down to save this guy's life. The weather is entirely indifferent to some dying lost guy. Meteorology is what determines weather, not one man's desire to make it home to raise his daughter. Do you know how many people have died in the desert? What kind of egomaniacal, magical thinking could lead someone to believe the desert made a special exception for them? As it relates to the dying man's good fortune, coincidence says the rainfall was a stroke of dumb luck. Synchronicity says it was deus ex machina in the literal meaning of the term, God from the machine. So the perception of synchronicity is, in my mind, an inherently religious impulse. And that's why I think it makes for such an interesting topic, because I think how we interpret synchronicities in our life serves as a sort of litmus test for our belief in the supernatural. Call that supernatural God, karma, the universe, pick your parlance. It's the simplest and most accessible litmus test of faith I can think of, unmuddied by the peculiarities of each of our world religions. The question we can ask ourselves is simply, have I ever witnessed a higher order, external to myself, intervene in my life out of some regard for my personal narrative? I think for most of us, even the atheists among us, the answer is yes. Again, synchronicity doesn't have to be as dramatic as a desert rainfall spontaneously manifesting to save us when we're dying of thirst. Most of us perceive synchronicities in much more mundane scenarios. Anytime we simply say, this is a sign, that's the perception of synchronicity. Let's say you've been thinking of changing careers and going back to nursing school, and you pass a new billboard on your way to work for a nursing program. This is a sign, you say. Subtext, this is the universe trying to send you a message, intervening in the outer world to steer your life story in a certain direction. The universe cares about your career self-actualization. Let's say you're going for a walk, contemplating a move to California, and then what happens? That theme song from the OC, California, by Phantom Planet, suddenly starts playing on your Spotify Discover Weekly. It's clear as day, you think. The universe wants you to move to California. At least in observing my own mind and the minds of people I've met over the course of my life, I'd contend that most of us have these kinds of experiences periodically. I think the "this is a sign" claim is one that people in the modern age make quite commonly without raising any eyebrows. It flies completely under the radar. Even in a progressively a-religious culture, we can speak of our experiences with synchronicity quite freely without anyone claiming us old-fashioned. If you start spouting off about how God intervened 2,500 years ago to deliver the 10 Commandments to Moses at Mount Sinai for the good of the Israelites, people would probably look at you funny. But if you start talking about how the universe sent you personally a sign on your way home from work, people tend to be pretty comfortable with that. God intervening at the level of the collective? Perfectly delusional. The universe intervening at the level of the individual? Perfectly lucid. If you were to express the belief that if climate change gets severe enough, God will step in to heal our planet and preserve civilization, you would either be laughed out of the room or pilloried for being toxically unscientific. If, however, facing a layoff and foreclosure on your house, you express the belief that one day the universe will come along with an opportunity to help lift you out of financial ruin, I think most people would receive that as a healthy level of optimism. What explains this inconsistency, I'm not sure. Do we feel that the universe just doesn't have the firepower to intervene at the level of the collective? It cannot move mountains, only molehills. It can work only in small acts of synchronicity to accommodate the small needs of the individual, bending the laws of physics but never breaking them? Or is this inconsistency less about our scientific understanding of the world and more about our psychological understanding of the world? Is it simply a reflection of our centuries-long embrace of individualism and our half-century-long embrace of narcissism? Is it perhaps, as unsavory as it may be to admit, that we think our own individual thriving is more important than our collective survival? The proverbial I is more deserving of attention from the universe than the proverbial we. Psychology Today writes in its glossary entry on synchronicity, quote, "Though many people perceive signs or spiritual meaning in synchronistic events, most scientists believe that such events are more likely coincidences that only seem meaningful due to aspects of human thinking such as confirmation bias." End quote. That could very well be the case. In reality, we can't really ever prove or disprove whether the universe is operating with our individual stories in mind. These moments of synchronicity could be entirely one-sided, our own symbolical minds projecting a mirage out onto the world around us that isn't actually there. It could all be a gross overestimation of the importance of our humble little stories. All the horror and bloodshed the universe has allowed for over the course of human history, and it's taking the time to reach out to us on behalf of our well-being, it does seem a little delusional, especially here in the first world where many of us already have our baseline needs met anyway. But when synchronicity happens, and the phenomenon does inevitably present itself time to time, even to the die-hard atheist, I think it feels wrong to ignore it. It feels a bit too stubbornly rational to write it off as a mere coincidence when it's staring you in the face. I suppose I'll tie this all up with a few questions that I might humbly propose you ask yourself next time you encounter a synchronicity. First, think deeply about what the feeling of synchronicity means to you. Not so much about what the sign you appear to be receiving means, but about the very fact that the universe appears to be sending you signs at all, or intervening in your life in some other way. Ask yourself, did my humble little story really just come into contact with the motivations of the universe itself? Does my humble little story actually have that kind of cosmic significance? Is that what I really believe? Because if that is what I really believe, is that how I'm going to act once the potency of this moment wanes? Am I going to believe in one moment that there is some force out there of the highest order that has some regard for me and my story? However fleeting its presence might be, it is not totally indifferent to me. I've been recognized by the universe itself. I matter in that way. Am I going to believe in something that spectacularly supernatural in that one moment, and then in the next, list back toward nihilism, apathy, and begrudging my finite, flawed little life? It seems to me it's a kind of all-or-nothing proposition. What sense is there in a lukewarm faith? If you believe that you and your story are so important and so significant that they can touch the universe itself and be touched back by it, that you are not alone out here on this tiny spinning rock in space. You are not just some animal too intelligent for its own good, spraying madhouse projections out onto the world like a fire hose on the loose. Your story is real, and something out there recognizes it as such. These moments of synchronicity are a two-sided exchange. Then own that belief fully, and however you own such a wondrously preposterous belief, that is, of course, up to you.